Marcus Chen had seen terrible things in his 12 years as a combat medic, and he believed that nothing could surprise him anymore, but he was wrong about that. And the night everything changed started like any other. Mission in a place he was not supposed to talk about. His unit had been sent to a remote area in Eastern Europe, where the forests were thick and the locals refused to go near certain places after dark. And Marcus thought this was just superstition from people who had lived through too many wars. But the fear in their eyes was real and deep and ancient. The helicopter dropped them near an old Soviet facility that had been abandoned for decades. And their orders were simple, which was to investigate reports of unusual activity and secure the location until a special team arrived. And nobody told them what kind of activity or why a special team was needed. Marcus carried his medical kit and his weapon and followed his squad leader through the rusted gates. And the building looked like it had been left in a hurry many years ago, with papers scattered on floors and equipment covered in dust and doors hanging open like mouths trying to scream. They found the first body in a hallway on the second floor. And it was not human, and Marcus stopped breathing for a moment when his flashlight showed him what it was. Because the creature had gray skin and limbs that bent in wrong directions and a face that was almost human, but stretched too far. His squad leader cursed and called for backup. But their radios only gave them static, and the walls of this place were too thick or something else was blocking their signals. And they had no choice but to keep moving deeper into the facility. The facility. Lower levels were worse than anything Marcus could have imagined. And they found cells with thick glass walls and heavy locks. And inside these cells were things that should not exist, creatures of different shapes and sizes. Some that looked almost like people and others that looked like nothing from this world. Most of the cells were empty with their doors torn open from the inside. But some still held prisoners, and these beings watched the soldiers with eyes that glowed in the darkness. And Marcus felt their stares like cold fingers touching his spine. A young private named Torres asked what they should do, and nobody had an answer, because their training had prepared them for human enemies and natural disasters and even chemical attacks, but not for monsters in cages beneath the ground. Then the shooting started from somewhere above them, and Marcus heard explosions and screaming and the sound of something heavy crashing through walls. And his squad leader ordered them to move back toward the exit. But the stairs were already blocked by rubble. They were trapped in the lower levels with the creatures in the cells. And the sounds of battle above them grew louder. And Marcus understood that someone else had come to this place, and they were not friendly. A woman appeared in the doorway, and she was bleeding from a wound on her head, and her uniform was torn. And she told them that a hostile force had attacked the facility to capture the specimens. And she used that word like she was talking about animals in a zoo. The squad leader asked her who she was. And she said her name was Agent Wells, and she worked for people who knew about these things. And right now their only chance was to release the creatures and hope they would fight against the attackers. Marcus thought she was insane, and he said so. But Agent Wells walked to the nearest cell and pressed buttons on a panel, and the door slid open with a hiss, and the thing inside stepped out into the corridor. It was tall and thin with skin like old leather and teeth that were too sharp and too many. And it looked at the soldiers with hunger in its yellow eyes. And Marcus raised his weapon, even though he knew bullets would probably do nothing. But Agent Wells spoke to the creature in a language that hurt to hear, and it turned away from the soldiers and ran toward the sounds of fighting. And Marcus heard screaming moments later that did not come from human throats. One by one, Agent Wells opened the cells, and the creatures rushed past the soldiers without attacking them. And Marcus watched beings from nightmares charge into battle against enemies he could not see. And he wondered if he had gone insane, or if the world had always been this way. The next 3 days were the longest of his life. And Marcus fought beside things he had no names for against humans who wanted to capture them. And he used his medical skills on wounds that should not be possible to treat, and saw bodies heal in ways that broke every rule he had learned. There was a vampire. And Marcus knew this because he saw it drink blood from a fallen enemy, and its wounds closed like they had never existed. And it looked at Marcus with red eyes and said nothing, but also did not attack him. There was something that moved through shadows like water flows through pipes. And it killed without sound and left no trace. And Marcus only knew it was on their side because it never came for him. There was a creature that looked like a woman, but her skin changed colors with her moods. And her hands could become claws or tentacles or things with no name. And she protected the soldiers when they were overwhelmed and asked for nothing in return. Marcus bandaged wounds on flesh that was cold or hot, or covered in scales. And he gave water to beings that probably did not need it. And he spoke gentle words to creatures that might not understand him. Because this was what he did, and this was who he was. When the extraction team finally arrived, Marcus was the only one from his original squad still alive. And he sat in the helicopter with Agent Wells and 3 of the creatures who had survived. And nobody spoke because there were no words for what had happened. The vampire sat across from him and studied his face. And then it said something that Marcus would never forget, which was that most humans ran or froze or died when they saw things like them. But Marcus had just kept working and helping and surviving. Marcus did not know how to answer this. So he said nothing, and the vampire almost smiled with its terrible mouth and closed its eyes. For the rest of the flight, Agent Wells told him that he would be debriefed, and then he would sign papers that promised he would never speak about this. And his official record would say he was on a training exercise that went wrong. And he would go back to his normal life and pretend this never happened. But Marcus knew that nothing would ever be normal again, because he had learned the first hard truth about the world, which was that monsters were real and humanity was not alone, and the darkness held things that most people would never believe. Looked out the window at the clouds below them and wondered how many other secrets were hidden in the world. And he did not know that this was only the beginning of his journey into the shadows, where humans and monsters walked together. 6 months passed after Marcus returned from Eastern Europe, and he tried to live a normal life like they told him to. But every shadow seemed deeper now, and every stranger on the street might be something other than human. And he could not sleep without seeing yellow eyes and sharp teeth in his dreams. He worked at a veterans hospital during the day and sat alone in his apartment at night. And he read every book he could find about folklore and mythology and legends, because he needed to understand what he had seen and what else might be hiding in the world. His therapist thought he had post-traumatic stress from combat. And Marcus let her believe this because the truth would put him in a different kind of hospital. And he smiled and nodded and said the right things while his mind wandered to creatures in cells beneath the frozen ground. The woman appeared on a Tuesday afternoon when Marcus was walking home from work. And she wore a gray suit and had eyes that seemed to see everything and notice details that normal people missed. And she fell into step beside him like they were old friends. She said her name was Director Shaw, and she knew what had happened in Eastern Europe because she was the one who had sent Agent Wells to that facility. And she apologized for what Marcus had experienced, but she was not sorry that he had survived. Marcus asked her what she wanted, and she smiled in a way that was not warm but was honest. And she said she wanted to offer him a job that would either kill him or give his life a purpose he had never imagined. They walked to a coffee shop and sat in a corner booth where nobody could hear them. And Director Shaw told Marcus about an organization that had existed for over 100 years in different forms under different names. And its purpose was to monitor supernatural threats and maintain peace between humans and non-human beings. Marcus laughed at first because it sounded like something from a movie. But Director Shaw did not laugh. and her eyes were serious and tired, like someone who had carried heavy secrets for too long. She explained that the world was divided into territories controlled by different factions, and vampires held some regions while other creatures claimed different areas. And humans were allowed to live their normal lives because these beings found it convenient and because certain agreements had been made. The organization Director Shaw worked for was the bridge between these worlds, and they negotiated treaties and resolved conflicts and sometimes used force when diplomacy failed. And they needed humans who could work alongside non-human beings without fear or hatred. Marcus asked why they would want him, and Director Shaw said that his actions in the facility had been noticed by beings who rarely noticed humans at all, and he had shown that he could remain calm and helpful even when surrounded by monsters. And this was a rare quality that could not be taught. She gave him a week to decide, and then she stood up and walked away. And Marcus sat alone in the coffee shop with a business card that had only a phone number and no name. He spent the week thinking about his life and where it was going, and he realized that he had been waiting for something without knowing what it was. And maybe this was the answer to questions he had been afraid to ask. On the seventh day, Marcus called the number and a voice told him where to go. And he packed a small bag and left his apartment without looking back. The training facility was hidden beneath a mountain in a place he was not allowed to name. And Marcus spent 3 months learning things that made his military training seem like children playing games. And he studied the history of supernatural beings and the treaties that kept the peace and the weapons that could hurt things that were not human. He met other recruits who had their own stories of encounters with the impossible, and some of them had been saved by creatures and some had been attacked and survived. And all of them had been changed in ways that made normal life feel like wearing clothes that no longer fit. His first assignment came on a cold morning in December, and Director Shaw called him into her office and told him he would be joining a field team for a mission in the Carpathian Mountains, and his role would be medical support and liaison. Marcus asked what liaison meant, and Director Shaw said it meant he would be the connection between the human members of the team and the non-human members. And she paused before adding that he would be the only fully human member. The team gathered in a briefing room that evening, and Marcus met his new partners for the first time, and he understood immediately why they needed someone like him. There were 2 vampires named Victor and Elena who had been alive for over 300 years, and they looked at Marcus with the kind of boredom that came from seeing countless humans live and die while they remained unchanged. And Victor made a joke about bringing snacks on the mission that was clearly meant to make Marcus uncomfortable. There was a woman called Faze who could move through solid objects like they were made of air, and her real name and origin were classified even from her own team. And she looked through Marcus when he introduced himself like he was not worth the effort of seeing. And there was something ancient that called itself the Watcher, and it appeared as a tall figure in dark robes with a face that changed every time Marcus tried to look at it directly. And it had been alive since before humans built cities, and it spoke with a voice like wind through dead leaves. The mission briefing explained that a cult in the mountains was attempting to summon an entity from another dimension, and this entity was dangerous enough that even the vampires looked worried when they heard its name. And their job was to stop the ritual and eliminate the cult before the summoning could be completed. Victor asked why they needed a human on the team, and Director Shaw said that Marcus had proven himself in combat and his medical skills might be necessary. But Marcus saw the doubt in the vampire's eyes and knew that Victor considered him a burden at best. They flew to Romania on a private plane, and Marcus sat alone while the others talked in languages he did not understand. And Faze faced through the wall to use the bathroom just to show that she could. And the Watcher sat perfectly still and watched Marcus with eyes that held 10,000 years of memories. Elena was the only one who spoke to him during the flight, and she asked about his experience in Eastern Europe with something that might have been genuine curiosity. And when he told her about bandaging the wounds of creatures he could not name, she almost smiled. She said that most humans could not do what he had done, and most humans would have been too afraid to help beings that might kill them without warning. And perhaps he was different from the others. She had known Marcus, thanked her for the kind words, but he saw Victor watching them with displeasure, and he understood that Elena's approval did not mean the others would accept him. Helicopter dropped them on a mountain slope as the sun was setting, and Marcus looked up at the peaks that touched the clouds and felt very small and very mortal, and he wondered if he would survive long enough to see them again. The Watcher moved past him without a word, and Victor and Elena followed with their supernatural grace, and Faze simply vanished and reappeared further up the slope, and Marcus was left to climb through the snow on his own human legs, with his human lungs burning in the thin air. He had been given a chance to prove himself in a world of monsters, and he would not waste it. But as he struggled up the mountain while the others waited with impatience, he could not help wondering if he was anything more than a liability to beings who had powers he could never possess. The cult compound was built into the mountain itself, and from the outside it looked like nothing more than old ruins covered in snow. But Marcus could feel something wrong in the air, like electricity before a storm. And even the vampires moved more carefully as they approached. Victor said he could smell blood from inside, and it was fresh and there was a lot of it. And Elena added that she could hear chanting from deep underground. And the ritual had already begun. The Watcher raised one hand and the air around them grew thick with ancient power. And it said that protective wards surrounded the compound, and they would need to find another way inside, because even its abilities could not break through barriers that had been built over centuries. Faze volunteered to scout ahead since the wards should not affect her phasing ability, and she stepped through the stone wall of the ruins and disappeared. And Marcus waited with the others in the cold darkness while wind howled around them. She did not return, and minutes passed that felt like hours, and Victor grew impatient and said they should force their way through. And Elena warned that the wards would burn them if they tried. Watcher closed its eyes and reached out with senses that Marcus could not understand. And then it said that Faze was trapped inside, caught by barriers that she could not phase through. And the cult had prepared for beings like them. This changed everything. And Victor cursed in a language that had been dead for 200 years. And Elena looked at the ruins with new fear in her ancient eyes. And even the Watcher seemed uncertain for the first time. Since Marcus had met it, they found an entrance that was not protected by wards. And it was clearly a trap, but they had no other choice. And Marcus followed the others into darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. The tunnels beneath the mountain were old beyond measure, and Marcus saw symbols carved into the walls that made his head hurt when he looked at them too long. And the air grew warmer as they descended. Even though they were moving away from the surface, Victor was the first to fall. And it happened so fast that Marcus barely saw it. And one moment the vampire was leading the way, and the next he was on the ground screaming as silver chains wrapped around him from the shadows. Elena tried to help her partner, but more chains came for her, and these were inscribed with symbols that glowed red when they touched her skin. And she collapsed beside Victor with smoke rising from her flesh. Where the silver burned, the Watcher tried to use its power against the attackers, but something was wrong. And Marcus watched as the ancient being struggled against invisible forces that should not have been able to touch it. And then chains of pure darkness wrapped around its form, and it fell silent, and still cult members emerged from hidden passages. And they wore black robes and masks that covered their faces. And their leader walked toward Marcus with the confidence of someone who had already won. He was a tall man with white hair and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. And he introduced himself as Father Matthias, and he welcomed Marcus to the end of everything the old world had built. Marcus raised his weapon, but Father Matthias only laughed. And he said that bullets could not hurt him because he had made deals with powers beyond human understanding. And the protective charms he wore would turn any attack back on the attacker. The cult members secured the fallen team members with more chains and symbols. And Marcus was left standing alone because Father Matthias found it amusing that the organization had sent a mere human alongside. These supposed monsters. Father Matthias explained his plan while his followers continued their preparations. And Marcus listened because understanding the enemy was the first step toward defeating them. And information was a weapon that required no ammunition. The cult believed that humanity was doomed to extinction unless they could summon and control beings from other dimensions. And Father Matthias had spent decades gathering the knowledge and power needed to open a doorway to realms that should never be touched. He said the monsters that walked among humans were proof that reality was larger than most people knew, and they had ruled from the shadows for too long. And it was time for humanity to seize power for itself by summoning something even the ancient ones feared. Marcus looked at his fallen teammates and saw Victor straining against chains that burned him with every movement. And Elena was crying tears of blood as silver pressed against her throat. And Faze was visible now trapped behind walls of glowing symbols that she could not pass through. And the Watcher was bound by darkness that seemed to eat away at its very being. They were helpless, and they were afraid, and Marcus realized that their fear was the same fear he felt in his own heart. Because pain and death and failure did not care if you were human or vampire or something older than memory. Father Matthias offered Marcus a choice, and he said that Marcus could join the cult and be part of the new order that would control all supernatural beings. Or he could die here with the monsters he had foolishly chosen to serve. The cult leader spoke of how the vampires had treated Marcus with contempt, and how Faze had looked through him like he was nothing, and how the Watcher had never bothered to speak to him as an equal. And Father Matthias asked why Marcus would risk his life for creatures that would never truly accept. And Marcus thought about these words, and there was truth in them, because he had felt the dismissal and the mockery and the casual cruelty of beings who measured their lives in centuries while his would be over in decades. But then he looked at Victor, and he saw not a predator, but a creature in agony fighting against chains that should have broken his spirit long ago. And Victor was still fighting because giving up was not in his nature. He looked at Elena, and he saw not a monster, but someone who had shown him kindness when she had no reason to. And her tears were real, and her fear was real, and her pain was real. He looked at Faze, and he saw not an arrogant being who thought herself above humans, but a woman who had volunteered to scout ahead to protect her team. And now she was trapped and alone and beating against walls she could not pass. She looked at the Watcher, and he heard the sound it made as the dark chains tightened, and Marcus realized it was pleading. And this being that had seen civilizations rise and fall was begging for help that might never come. They were not so different from humans after all, and their immortality and power did not protect them from suffering. And in this moment of defeat they were just as vulnerable as any soldier Marcus had ever treated on a battlefield. Father Matthias asked for his answer, and Marcus looked at the cult leader and felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. And it was the same feeling he had known in every desperate moment of every impossible situation he had ever survived. He said no, and his voice was steady even though his hands were shaking. And Father Matthias sighed like a disappointed teacher and ordered his followers to chain Marcus with the others. They put Marcus in a cell with walls of stone and a door of iron, and they left him there while they prepared for the final ritual. And Marcus sat in darkness and began to think about everything he had seen and learned. Since entering this place, the others were counting on him now, and he was just a human with no supernatural powers and no ancient knowledge and no immortal strength. But he was alive, and he was free to move within his cell, and his mind was still working. Sometimes that was enough, and Marcus began to plan. Marcus sat in the darkness of his cell and let his mind work through the problem like he had been trained to do, in situations where panic meant death. And he started with what he knew and built outward from there. The cult had prepared for supernatural threats, but they had underestimated humans because they saw mortality as weakness. And this meant the cell holding Marcus was probably the simplest in the compound. And they had not bothered to check him thoroughly, because what could a mere human do? He reached into his boot and found the small knife he always carried. And he reached into his collar and found the lockpick hidden in the fabric. And he checked the pockets they had missed and found a small flashlight and a packet of medical supplies. These were not much against an army of cultists protected by ancient magic. But Marcus had learned long ago that wars were not won by the biggest weapons, but by the soldiers, who refused to quit. He picked the lock on his cell door in 4 minutes. And the hallway outside was empty because the cult was focused on their ritual. And Marcus moved through shadows like he had moved through enemy territory 100 times before. The first thing he needed was information. And he found it in a room full of books and papers where the cult kept their research. And Marcus read as fast as he could while listening for footsteps. That the wards protecting the compound were powered by a combination of ancient symbols and modern technology. And Marcus found diagrams showing generators hidden throughout the mountain that fed electricity to amplifiers which strengthened the magical barriers. This was something he understood, because machines could be broken and power could be cut. And he memorized the locations of the generators before moving on. The second thing he needed was a way to free his teammates, and he found this in the same research room. And the cult had written detailed notes about how to bind different types of supernatural beings, because they planned to capture and control many more. Victor and Elena were held by silver chains inscribed with binding symbols, and the symbols had to remain complete for the binding to work. And disrupting even one symbol would break the spell phase. Was trapped by wards that prevented her from phasing through anything within their range. And these wards were connected to one of the generators. And destroying it would free her. The Watcher was bound by chains of concentrated darkness, pulled from dimensions beyond normal space. And these chains required constant power from a ritual circle that had to be maintained by cult members. And if those members were interrupted, the chains would fade. Marcus had his plan, and now he needed to execute it. And he moved through the compound like a ghost. While the cult focused on their summoning ritual, he found the first generator in a small room guarded by 2 cult members. And they did not expect a human to be wandering free. And Marcus used his training to put them down without killing them, because he was still a medic at heart, and taking lives was a last resort. The generator was a modern machine connected to cables that ran into the walls. And Marcus used his knife to cut the cables and listened to the hum of power fade. And somewhere in the compound, a section of wards flickered and died. He found the second generator and then the third. And each time he moved carefully and used surprise and speed to overcome guards who never expected a human to be a threat. And each time the power in the compound dropped a little more. The fourth generator was in the ritual chamber itself. And Marcus watched from a hidden passage as cult members chanted around a circle of symbols that pulsed with sick light. And Father Matthias stood at the center directing the ceremony. His teammates were displayed around the room like trophies. And Victor and Elena were still wrapped in silver chains. And Faze was beating against invisible walls with bloody hands. And the Watcher was barely visible beneath coils of darkness that seemed to be consuming it. Marcus could not reach the generator without being seen. But he noticed something else that made him think of his grandmother and the story she had told him when he was young. The B symbols on the floor were old. And his grandmother had come from Romania, and she had known things about the old ways that she had passed to Marcus in stories and songs. and he recognized some of the symbols as belonging to traditions that predated the cult by thousands of years. These symbols had rules, and his grandmother had taught him some of those rules without ever explaining why. And Marcus remembered that certain patterns could be disrupted by introducing elements that did not belong. He looked at his medical kit and found what he needed. And it was a simple thing that the cult would never have considered a threat. And he waited for the right moment. Father Matthias raised his hands, and the chanting grew louder. And the light from the symbols became blinding. And Marcus threw a packet of salt into the center of the ritual circle. Salt was pure and clean, and it had been used for protection in every culture his grandmother had told him about. And it landed on a symbol that was key to the entire pattern. And the effect was immediate. The light flickered, and the chanting faltered. And Father Matthias screamed in rage and ordered his followers to find the source of the disruption. And in that moment of chaos, Marcus ran for the generator. He cut the cables, and the wards holding Faye's collapsed. And she looked around in shock before understanding flooded her face. And she phased through the floor and reappeared behind the cult members who were maintaining the ritual circle that bound the watchers. She disrupted them without mercy, and the chains of darkness began to fade. And the watcher rose with fury in its ancient eyes, and his voice shook the mountain as it spoke words that made cult members fall unconscious where they stood. Marcus ran to Victor and Elena, and he used his knife to scratch through the symbols on their chains. And the bindings broke, and the vampires surged to their feet with hunger and rage. The battle was short and brutal, and Marcus stayed out of the way while beings of tremendous power tore through the cult like wind through dry leaves. And Father Matthias tried to run, but the watcher caught him and did something that Marcus could not see and did not want to understand when it was over. Marcus sat on the floor of the ritual chamber and breathed and tried to stop his hands from shaking. And his teammates gathered around him in a way that felt different from before. Victor knelt beside him and looked at Marcus with eyes that held something new. And it might have been respect or wonder or simply confusion at what had just happened. And he asked how Marcus had known what to do. Marcus said he had paid attention and used what he knew and refused to give up. And these were not special powers, but they were what he had. And sometimes that was enough. Elena touched his shoulder gently and said that in 300 years she had never been rescued by a human. And Faze appeared beside him, and for the first time she actually looked at him like he was real and worth seeing. The watcher approached last, and it stood over Marcus like a tower of shadow and age. And when it spoke, its voice was soft in a way that Marcus had not heard before. It said that it had watched humans for 10,000 years and thought it understood their limitations. But Marcus had shown it something new, and perhaps mortality was not the weakness it had always believed. Marcus did not know what to say, so he simply nodded. And the watcher made a sound that might have been laughter from something that had forgotten how to laugh. They left the compound as dawn was breaking over the mountains. And the walk back to the extraction point was long, but this time the others matched their pace to Marcus instead of leaving him behind. And Victor walked beside him and asked questions about human medicine while Elena watched with a small smile. Faze phased ahead to scout, but she came back to report instead of simply disappearing. And the watcher stayed close and said nothing, but its presence felt protective rather than dismissive. Something had changed in the mountains, and Marcus had earned something that he had not expected. And it was not just survival but belonging. And he realized that proving himself had never been about matching their power, but about showing them who he was. He was human and mortal and fragile, but he was also stubborn and clever and brave. And these qualities had value even among immortals. 20 years passed after the mission in the Carpathian Mountains, and Marcus Chun became something that had never existed before in the long history of the organization. And he was a human who was genuinely respected by beings who had lived through the rise and fall of empires. He worked as a field medic and liaison for hundreds of missions, And each time he proved that his value was not measured in strength, or speed, or immortality, but in his ability to think, and adapt and connect with others, regardless of what they were. The vampires, Victor and Elena, became his friends in a way that surprised everyone, including themselves. And they invited him to their home and introduced him to others of their kind. And Marcus learned that vampires could laugh and love and fear just like humans, even if they lived forever. Face revealed her real name to him after 3 years of working together. And it was Sarah, and she told him the story of how she had become what she was. And she cried while she spoke, and Marcus held her hand because that was what friends did. Watcher became something like a mentor to Marcus, and it shared knowledge that it had kept secret for millennia. And Marcus learned about the history of the world that no human book contained. And he understood that reality was far stranger and more beautiful than most people would ever know. Director Shaw promoted Marcus to lead the training program for new human recruits, and he taught them everything he had learned about working with supernatural beings. And his first lesson was always the same. He told them that monsters were not so different from humans, and fear and pain and loneliness were universal, even among immortals. And the key to working with them was to see them as individuals rather than categories. He taught them that human limitations were not weaknesses but opportunities. And mortality gave humans a perspective that immortals had lost or never possessed. And every moment mattered when you knew your time was limited. He showed them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. And humans had been making that choice for as long as they had existed. And it was the most powerful thing about their species. The recruits went on to serve with distinction, and many of them formed bonds with supernatural beings that would have seemed impossible a generation earlier. And Marcus watched with pride as the wall between worlds became a bridge. His body aged while his partners remained unchanged. And his hair turned gray, and his joints began to ache, and his eyes needed glasses to read small text. And the vampires and creatures around him stayed exactly as they had always been. Some of them struggled with this. And Elena told Marcus that watching him grow old was harder than she had expected. And she asked if he wanted to become like them and live forever. And she said she could make it happen if he chose. Marcus thought about this offer for a long time. And there was a part of him that was tempted, because who would not want to escape death? But in the end he said no. He explained that his mortality was not a curse but a gift. And it was what made every friendship precious, and every victory meaningful, and every act of courage significant. And if he lived forever, he might lose the very thing that had made him valuable in the first place. Elena cried again when she heard this, and Victor pretended something was in his eye. And the Watcher nodded slowly, like Marcus had passed a test it had been waiting decades to give. Marcus retired at 62 years old, and his body could no longer keep up with field work, even though his mind was still sharp. And he moved to a small house near the mountains where he could see the sunrise. Every morning, the organization gave him a farewell gathering, and beings came from all over the world to attend. And there were vampires and shapeshifters and things that had no names in any human language. And they all came to say goodbye to a man who had changed how they saw humanity. The Watcher spoke at the gathering, and its voice carried weight that made everyone fall silent. And it said words that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. It said that in all its long existence, it had never met a human like Marcus Chun. And it had watched empires crumble and species die and stars burn out. But it had never seen anyone accomplish what Marcus had accomplished, had not conquered enemies or built monuments or gathered power. And these were the things that most beings considered important. But Marcus had done something harder and rarer. He had shown monsters that humans were worthy of respect. And he had shown humans that monsters were worthy of compassion. And he had built bridges between worlds that had been separated by fear and misunderstanding for thousands of years. The Watcher said that when it first met Marcus, it had seen a fragile creature whose life would be over in what seemed like moments. And it had wondered why the organization bothered to include such a being on their team. Now it understood. And human life was not valuable despite its brevity, but because of it. And every choice a human made carried weight that immortals could never truly feel. And every act of courage was performed in the shadow of certain death. This was what made humans remarkable. And Marcus had shown them all what it looked like when a human refused to be limited by mortality, and instead embraced it as the source of their strength. Marcus stood among beings that could kill him without effort and have lived through ages of history that he could barely imagine. And he felt more alive and more grateful than he had ever felt in his entire life. He thanked them for accepting him. And he thanked them for teaching him, and he thanked them for being his friends. And his voice cracked when he spoke because some emotions were too large for words. Victor stepped forward and hugged Marcus like a brother. And Elena kissed his cheek and whispered that she would never forget him. And Faze, who was now Sarah, put her hand on his shoulder and said he had taught her how to be real again. Watcher approached last, and it bent its ancient form down to look Marcus in the eyes. And it asked him if he had any regrets about the path he had chosen. Marcus thought about his life and all the danger and fear and pain he had experienced. And he thought about the friends he had made and the lives he had saved and the understanding he had helped create. He said his only regret was that he did not have more time. And this made the Watcher make that sound again that might have been laughter. And it said that this was the most human answer possible. And it was exactly right. Marcus Chen lived for another 15 years in his house, near the mountains. And he was never alone because old friends visited often and new ones came to hear his stories. And he spent his final years knowing that his life had meant something when he died peacefully in his sleep, 77 years old. Beings from across the world mourned him. And vampires who had not cried in centuries wept for a human who had shown them what true strength looked like. The Watcher came to his funeral and spoke again. And it said that Marcus Chun would be remembered long after most immortals were forgotten. And his legacy was not buildings or empires, but something more durable and more precious. He had changed hearts and minds. And that change would ripple outward through generations of humans and monsters alike. And the world was better because he had been in it at the end of everything. That was the true measure of a life well lived, and Marcus had lived better than most. And his strength had been the most human kind of all. It was the strength to look at the darkness and acknowledge the fear and step forward anyway. And to do this not once, but every single day. And to never stop believing that courage and kindness and connection mattered more than power or immortality. This was what humans had to offer. And it was enough, and it would always be enough.